Chapter 68. The humiliation of queuing like this, as though he was just another punter, was antagonising Mr. Thumb. What little tether he had left reached its end. There were at least 10 others in the slow-moving queue before him, and if the doorman denied him again, he swore he wouldn't be responsible for the aftermath. Invoking the psychic force of a long-forgotten pantheon of gods, the man with the cloven thumb made some arcane gestures across his body and, in the final part of the ancient obeisance, lifted his head to the sky. At precisely that moment, a single drop of rain fell from the darkness above, landed on his forehead, rolled over his brow, down his cheek, and into his mouth. It tasted salty. He smiled to himself. Not a raindrop, then. So that was where she was. Ray wasn't here in the simulation, but she wasn't exactly conscious either. Didn't that girl just pick her moments?
Your name's not Dan. You're not coming in.
The bouncer dismissed the trendy couple at the front, and they walked away, pretending not to be disappointed.
Oi, you.
The doorman jerked his head at Mr. Thumb, ushering him forward. Stepping out of the queue, he strolled past the others and up to the door again, grinning from ear to ear. The bouncer drew a thick forefinger down Mr. Thumb's cheek, tracing the line that Ray's tear had taken, then licked his fingertip.
Yeah, go on then,
he said, and steered him inside with a firm hand. The small entrance was misleading. Inside, Mr. Thumb saw how large the place was, with a capacity up in the thousands. And tonight was sold out. People were milling about everywhere, and as he edged past those gathered in the foyer, he caught sight of the darkened concert hall ahead. Strobes and lasers flashed over the heads of the crowd, and the sound system sent the low bass notes of the band through his ribcage and feet. His big, fat smile got bigger and fatter. This was his kind of simulation. With a single skip, the man with the cloven thumb altered his cadence and stepped in time to the rhythm of the music. He strutted on, dancing his way through the crowd, seeping through gaps like a fog, ducking and sliding along temporary channels in the mass of people. With a whirl and a wink, he relieved a somewhat dazed man of his beer, whilst leaving him with the impression that something auspicious had just happened. Oh, he was good at this. As he reached a spot near the centre of the stalls, the music broke for a few beats, and the stage lights turned upon the hall in a golden flood. Mr. Thumb span on his heels to take in the space. A multitude of heads in the sea around him. A circle balcony above, its facade ornate like the classical proscenium arch that framed the stage, a contrast to the modern lighting rig and banks of PA speakers flown up into its vaults. The beat kicked in again, and the lights focused back on the stage in time for the band to deliver the chorus. And Mr. Thumb got his first taste of disappointment. According to the holographic banner projecting over them, the band were known as Hong Kong Thunder Hair, and they were miming. It was pretty blatant. The lead vocalist kept cutting off his phrases sooner than the soundtrack, and his choreographed dance routine had him panting and sweating with exertion, yet his vocals were immaculate, not a gasp or a gulp. The guitarist was also dancing along, and the steps were clearly taking a great deal of concentration. His hands never moved position on the fretboard, no matter the changes in the song. Their eyes trained on the middle distance, Hong Kong Thunderhair finished the number, then bowed deeply with pride. The wave of applause and cheering they seemed to expect turned out to be more of a slight ripple. A box of old boots being emptied down a flight of stairs. The band didn't take any notice. Their motions between songs seemed as rehearsed as their lip-syncing, and they carried on as though they'd brought the house down, sucking up great bellyfuls of imaginary adoration.
Ugh.
Mr. Thumb screwed his face up, his stomach suddenly queasy. Arms crossed, he leaned into his neighbour and asked if this was the main act. He was relieved to hear it wasn't. The headliners were due on in a little while, so Hong Kong Thunderhair should wrap it up soon. The man with the cloven thumb drained the beer he'd nabbed and slung the plastic container with its last mouthful of backwash at the stage.
You suck!
He called with a sly look at those around him. A few people blinked and shuffled, but no one reacted. In fact, as he made his way to the bar to wait for the headliners, Mr. Thumb noted how reserved the crowd seemed. For such a throng, the atmosphere was somewhat aloof. Like the kids queuing outside, they were young, self-conscious, and painfully aware of their appearance. Everybody was playing it cool, either listening to the next song with detached indifference, or else tapping out messages on their eyelines. Being alone in the simulation had him feeling out of sorts. As a rule, he was the coolest person in the room, without a doubt. But right now, he felt like some sad uncle escorting a niece to her first gig and trying too hard to be fucking hip. He took his shades off, elbowed his way to the bar and drew the service drone over to him with a squint and the power of his mind.
1 bourbon, 1 scotch, and 1 beer,
he scowled. How was he supposed to interpret all this? Plastic band, plastic crowd. What was this cluster up to? Turning around, he saw that just about everyone nearby was staring at their eyeline display. There was very little actual contact occurring in the simulation.
Hey,
he nodded at the young girl next to him.
Who's on next?
Shutting down her display, she blinked with mild irritation at the interruption. The rope service? The girl didn't exactly roll her eyes at his question. She didn't really need to.
And they're the main event, yeah? The big name?
Now came the eye roll. Really? You didn't know you were coming to a rope service gig?
Well, actually, I came here with a friend.
The man with the cloven thumb stopped himself. He was getting defensive. Terrible idea. He struck a more confident tone.
No, clearly I haven't. They any good or what?
The girl stared at him in open-mouthed wonder, then turned to her boyfriend to see if she'd heard this clueless buffoon correctly. But the young lad was too absorbed by his own projection. Well, the young woman continued with a look somewhere between pity and disgust. The rope service don't care if they're any good? She shook her head and went back to her eyeline. That's kind of the point. Mr. Thumb slugged his bourbon back and bared his teeth.
Shouldn't you be necking with your fella or something? I remember when love bites were obligatory for teenagers.
The girl didn't even look up. She just raised an eyebrow and walked off, tugging her boyfriend with her by his shirt. The man with the cloven thumb cursed to himself in 3 forgotten languages. He didn't want to lose his temper again. This was neither an average simulation nor an average cluster, and he was meant to be solving problems, not creating them. At least Hong Kong Thunderhair had finished. They were bowing again and raising their hands appreciatively to several thousand people who paid them little attention. The guitarist pretended to make eye contact with someone, nodded a fake acknowledgement, and flicked his plectrum into the crowd. A woman picked it up off the floor and tossed it back on stage with a careful underarm. The support band's holograms came down, and as a clamour of roadie drones busied themselves with the PA and instruments, the venue projected a swirl of interval visuals and played some background music. The lights dimmed the moment the roadie drones zipped off, and a single white spotlight found centre stage.
"Ladies and gentlemen," a voice purred over the PA, "please put your hands together for the act you've all been waiting for, the rope service."
Everyone clapped, and Mr. Thumb whooped with gusto, hands cupped round his mouth.
"Oi, oi! Come on then."
It dawned on him that nobody else was calling out, and he suddenly felt unsure of himself. He dialed it down to enthusiastic clapping and hoped this next band would warm the crowd up. The stage stayed dark, the spotlight empty. A double-stroke kick drum started up, rumbling its cannonade in tandem with the bass guitars strumming on a single note again and again. The tension built until a distorted guitar rose into a deafening wail that seemed to slice through the air. The frontman stepped into the light, swaying in time, his 2 skinny legs sticking out from under an oversized Hawaiian shirt. His arms and neck splashed with tattoos, collar-length hair tucked behind his ears, his facial hair shaggy and unkempt. He was playing bass, slapping a thumb on the single note, eyes wide with adrenaline, warning the audience of what was to come. The 2 guitarists ground into the main riff, a punky outburst spitting with energy. The lights came up, flickering behind each member of the band in turn, casting them into silhouettes as they thrashed and jumped about with the release of their wild opening tune. A sonic factory of sound. The frontman bounced to the front and roared his words. "Passenger of mass persuasion, leaders back into temptation." This was more like it, Mr. Thumb thought. His shades back on and both hands raised in the sign of the horns, he nodded along and was soon bashing out a prodigious air guitar to the chorus. "Keening for me, she's keening for me. Can't hold out against this, left here defenseless." It wasn't until the song ended that Mr. Thumb remembered that he was supposed to be making adjustments in this simulation. He ought to find some sign of Yolanta and Pascal's dispute with the rest of the board. The crowd had all burst into enthusiastic applause, but, given the unquestionable awesomeness of the band, the vibe was still distinctly mediocre. He'd have thought the whole place would have gone apeshit by now. The frontman had 1 foot up on the monitors at the edge of the stage, squinting out into the auditorium, talking to the crowd. "Thank you, thank you. That one was for me mum. I fucking love you, mum. She got me sober earlier this year. Saved me fucking life. A chorus of yells and cheers rose from another area of the stalls. The front man grinned in their direction. Yeah, right. Listen to your mother, yous lot. Don't be a cunt. Okay, this next one is off our first album. I hope you like it. It's called Bring Me the Slaps. The raucous rabble of fans he'd addressed couldn't have been happier. Mr. Thumb watched them jumping and pogoing around in glee, shouting their lungs out. So, he thought, making his way over, there is some life in here. He found them towards the front. There weren't more than 9 or 10 in their group, mostly young men, but there were a few women too. They all had a good head of steam on them, thin, lanky fellas who'd knocked back a proper skinful of something seriously stimulating. They were absolutely baked, jumping up and down as high as they could, singing along loyally to the band, smashing into one another and anyone else unlucky enough to be stood nearby. Yes, thought the man with the cloven thumb, his pulse picking up as he reached the wary circle around the moshers. My brethren. He'd found some real devotees. Most of the audience were a privileged bunch, you could tell, trendy and particular. Their clothes and accessories did not come cheap. Their complexions soft and full, implying a rounded diet and plenty of sleep. But not this lot. Their clothes were stained and torn in ways that seemed more careless than designed. The tattoos they sported had that scrappy, homemade quality to them. Underweight, with pasty complexions and dark rings around their eyes. They probably thought hepatitis B was a vitamin. And they loved the rope service. Mr. Thumb could see why. A Celtic post-punk phenomena. The band looked like they came from a similar background, the same rage, the same brutality, singing about the same troubles this lot had to deal with. An extension of the group, ambassadors for their provocative cause. And provoke they did. Orbiting around their neck-wrecking mosh pit, a few of the gang were pogoing up and down and pushing off the shoulders of bystanders. The crowd's indifference just seemed to rile them up, and their shoulder shoves were getting more aggressive. More beer was spilt and slopped over people, and although Mr. Thumb couldn't hear anything over the band, he could see them making derogatory remarks at the middle-class posers they were surrounded by. Eyes wild, daring these ponces to do something. Fuck yeah, thought Mr. Thumb. Fuck yeah. A sweaty, anemic-looking maniac came bouncing by him. Mr. Thumb necked his whiskey and got ready to join him on his rampage. Putting his arm around the lad's shoulders, the man with the cloven thumb hopped along with him. Here we go, he thought. Time to show these kids how to raise hell. A sharp jab in the ribs took the wind out of him, and with a shove he was thrust to the floor. Mr. Thumb looked up to see the kid yelling at him. Something about a lecherous old man and getting his filthy fucking hands off him. Seeing Mr. Thumb's surprise, the wiry little bastard creased up with laughter. The music shifted key, and the little shitweasel started jumping about again, deliberately stamping on Mr. Thumb's hand and spitting at him before pogoing off back to his mates. The man with a cloven thumb drew himself up to his full height and, breathing in the vital force of each and every universal element, strode towards the scrawny vermin, barging past anyone in the way. He caught the yob by his collar, span him around, and started pounding his lights out with an unrelenting series of steady and vigorous blows. Squashed under a pile of bodies in the melee that followed, unable to move his limbs, but fully capable of chewing an elbow which had found its way into his face, Mr. Thumb had a moment to reflect on his progress in this simulation. All things said and done, he had to admit he wasn't exactly doing a sterling job. Inhabiting the mind of an experienced panmatech, he'd expected to breeze all this group simulation stuff, the symbols, the metaphors. But as an unseen knee struck blindly into his ribs, he was starting to wonder if he was the right guy for the job. He hated to admit it, but all things considered, he could do with a bit of professional assistance. The man with the cloven thumb closed his eyes, slowed his heart rate to just a few beats per minute, clinched his lungs into a yogic breath trap, and squeezed a jet of dimethyltryptamine from the pineal gland in the centre of his brain. This plane of reality began to dissolve. It was time to find Ray.